In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the sources that you will need to locate and evaluate for your final project in New Mexico history. Hopefully you're familiar with this Google Doc that I have up on my screen right now. These are the guidelines for the final project. I think that most everyone, as I scroll down here, has already completed the topic and research question. If for some reason you have not done that, please let me know as soon as you can what your topic is, and if you need help with the research question, always better late than never on this, because that is a key step in completing the final project. By April 8th this semester, you will need to complete your annotated bibliography. So let me scroll down to that section. As you can read in more detail here on your own time, in your annotated bibliography, you will need to write 2 to 3 sentences. Try to keep it under 4 or 5 at the very most, but make sure you write at least 2 or 3 sentences that explain what your source is about, what it covers, how it relates to your topic. So there's a couple sentences right there. And then also a sentence that indicates why you find this source to be credible and or valuable for your project. And I think that distinction will become clearer in just a second. In terms of the types of sources you need one primary source, 2 academic secondary sources. You can watch that video to help you identify those sources, but generally anything that is peer-reviewed, that is a journal article, or that is published as a book by a university press will count as an academic secondary source. You need 3 other secondary sources, so a total of 5 secondary sources. 2 of those have to be academic. It's fine if all 5 of them are academic, but you might find blog posts or other kinds of websites, for example, relative to your source that you'll want to use, and that is more than fine. You'll also need to include 2 social media sources. And as I wrote here on the instructions, the idea behind using social media is to see if people are talking on the internet about your topic. If you find that you can't really locate any social media sources, that is okay. You just need to indicate that in your bibliography. You might say, I found a couple social media sources, but they were just so kind of irrelevant or ridiculous or silly, because that happens, that I didn't want to use them in this project. So as long as you indicate that you've looked and that you may or may not have found some, that is fine. But if you do find some, it is an interesting way to think about whether or not people outside of a history class are talking about your topic and care about it in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so that's the purpose of those. Hopefully, you will not have too much trouble locating a primary source. I only require 1 because I know that it can be difficult to find primary sources depending on what your topic is. But there are so many digitized things today that hopefully that shouldn't be a problem. If you find that you're having difficulty locating a primary source or any of these types of sources, let me know as soon as you can, and I can help you figure it out, or we can adjust the kinds of sources that you have based on the topic you chose. I want to talk to you a little bit then about evaluating these sources for your annotated bibliography, because remember, you need to explain why you find it credible, or if it's not quite credible, why you still think it's a valuable source for your research. I'm going to use the example, I'm switching tabs here, and I'm going to scroll up a little bit, of this paper that I just finished a couple of days ago on Pancho Villa State Park. I'm going to present it in 2 weeks at the Rocky Mountain Council on Latin American Studies conference in Reno. So I'm excited. I'm going to be going there and presenting this on a panel. I've been working on it for a little while, and it relates to the larger research project that I did for my dissertation that I'm now working on publishing as a book. So I have some background in the topic. For this, I used a few secondary sources. This is just one example of a secondary source. And I wanted to show this one to you because this is Google Books. So if you go books.google.com, you may or may not already know about that. You can search for books that you can pick up in the library or you can get previews of books that you might not be able to get access to in the library. For our project, you don't necessarily have to read the entirety of the books that you find for your research, but you do need to read the relevant sections of those books for your project and your questions. This one is called The Misplaced Massacre. It's about the memory of the Sand Creek Massacre that happened in 1864. But Ari Kelman, the author, who is an academic historian, I'm scrolling down to show you the title page. This one's published by Harvard University Press. So right there, that's something that indicates to me and for you, for this project, that this is acceptable as an academic secondary source. This source is helpful for my project because Kelman, as I get to the table of contents, he talks about the story behind creating a national monument to Sand Creek and the different kinds of perspectives and voices that went into that. So that's kind of relative to the project that many of us did on the discussion board about the Oñate statue and thinking about what alternative monuments might look like. He's looking at the actual case of Sand Creek. The National Historic Park was dedicated in 2007, and so he tells the story of the Cheyenne people and other indigenous groups in the area in southern Colorado that worked very hard to have their voices heard. Also thinking about the descendants of people like John Chivington, who led the forces that enacted the massacre in 1864. Quite a contentious monument, as you can probably imagine. So what I did with this for my project is I used it as a way of thinking about how monuments express different perspectives and different memories as kind of a theoretical framework for thinking about Pancho Villa State Park. And so if I was putting this entry into my annotated bibliography, that's what I would say. I would say this is about creating the monument at Sand Creek relative to historical memory in various perspectives. And I use this one for my project to help me think about the ways in which historical monuments reflect different perspectives, or can at least reflect different perspectives on the past. And I found this one to be a credible source because it's published by reputable university press, so I know that it's peer-reviewed. And I also know Ari Kelman's work as a history professor, and that he's an expert in this field. So that stands as the reasoning for why I think this is a good source. This source, as you may imagine, a Fox News source, sends up some red flags. And Fox News, of course, isn't the only outlet that would send up red flags, but it's one of them. And so I looked at this story published last August on Pancho Villa State Park. This was in the context of controversies over Confederate monuments. And as I scrolled down here and read the story, I found that this person had interviewed Richard Dean. I know Richard Dean because of my work down in Columbus with the research of that area. And I actually have had correspondence with him and done work in his personal archive. And I know that he has very strong opinions about Pancho Villa State Park and that he wants to see the name change. So for me, I'm using this as an example of a source that, or of an example of how Richard Dean is reaching out to the media and using different media outlets, whether it's Fox News, whether it's the Santa Fe New Mexican. He's also been interviewed there. He's been interviewed in the Deming Headlight, the Las Cruces Sun-Times. He's trying to get his message out that Pancho Villa State Park name needs to be changed. This is one of the outlets that he's used to do it. This is a national outlet. It can be a controversial one. And so it might get him some notoriety. And so those are the ways that I'm using this. But I also have to note that there's a misspelling here of Osama bin Laden. Pancho Villa did not have 1,000 soldiers, quote unquote. I wouldn't put that in scare quotes. There were 485 that killed 18 Americans. That's correct. Pershing's force was a bit smaller than that. So again, looking at this, and going down here, Pancho Villa State Park was dedicated in 1961. I mean, this thing's riddled with factual inaccuracies in terms of setting the context. So I need to note that in my annotated bibliography, that although this story has factual inaccuracies, it's a primary source because it's a recent article that interviews Richard Dean, and I'm still going to use it, and I'm going to note that it's problematic, but I'm going to say the reason that I'm using this and why it can still work is because it's evidence of Richard Dean's efforts to get his message out about what he thinks of Pancho Villa State Park and how the name needs to be changed. And just to kind of add a layer onto that, this is a primary source that I took photos of years ago when I did some research in Santa Fe at the Angelico Chavez History Library at the Palace of the Governors. And this, as you can read, is the Memorial Day service program from Columbus. So every March 9th, Richard Dean and the Columbus Historical Society, they have a memorial service to those who were killed during the raid. This was the program that year, and of course, this was right after 9/11. And if we scroll forward, so here's the inside of that. It has some historical photos, and it lists the names of those who were killed. On the back, I apologize for how blurry this is, both a function of my poor digital camera skills like 10 years ago, and also having this through a screencast. But you can see here on the back, terrorism past and present shows Columbus devastated, the photo, and Ground Zero in New York City. So this is a place where Richard Dean, as president of the Historical Society, kind of the spearhead behind this memorial service, started to refer to Pancho Villa as a terrorist and make that connection. And I found he was one of the voices most strongly in 2001, 2002 that wanted to make that claim and was using that platform to change the park's name. So again, you have to think through your primary sources. Quite often, we want to use primary sources or think of primary sources as somehow more pure or more accurate than secondary sources. It is absolutely true that they were closer to the actual events, but primary sources can tell us lies just as easily as any other source. So we have to read them against our other sources, and we have to think critically about them. One other thing I wanted to show you, so you can use Google Books or you can get actual books. I don't know, I can't actually see myself, so I'm not sure how well this is fitting in the frame. This is Friedrich Katz's book, The Life and Times of Pancho Villa. He's an expert on Villa. One of the reasons that I was able to think critically about my primary source is that I know from Katz and a few other things I've read that there were only 485 men at Columbus. For example, I know from the archives that I've used in Santa Fe that that Pancho Villa State Park, was dedicated in 1961. And so looking at those sources of secondary sources, reading them against each other, knowing they've been peer-reviewed and so on, helps me have a critical eye on my primary sources. So I hope that helps in terms of thinking about how to analyze historical sources, what kinds of things you could look for or should look for as you work on the annotated bibliography. Clicking on this one. If you're interested in reading this paper, I'd be happy to share it with you. If you don't care, that's also fine. I think Pancho Villa State Park's kind of interesting. Also, I'm going to be creating an Adobe Spark page for this presentation, and so I will share that with you as well. Remember that your final project on Spark, so that's at the end of April, is an enhanced essay, essentially. So you're going to bring in links to your sources as well as digital media, images, and things like that, videos if you find them from the internet, to make it hopefully more interesting and engaging than just a regular essay on your research. Hopefully, again, that's helpful. Please let me know what questions you have as you continue working on the project, and I am looking forward to reading those as you get them finished.